Heath, welcome to the podcast. I appreciate you taking the time. And from all the places for us to start with your storied career in the field, I want to start with Omics, a blog you kicked off in 2006 at kind of an interesting time in your career and have persisted pretty consistently since then, continuously posting on the field. But take us back to 2006 when you started things off, please. In 2006, yeah, your
Yeah,
first post.
yeah, no, so it's kind of interesting thing. I'd worked first job out of grad school was Millennium Pharmaceuticals. It was a very interesting place. It was a genomics focused drug discovery company primarily, though we also, like a lot of other companies with grand ambitions, we had a diagnostics play, we had an ag play. Uh, there were a couple other things that were more like, yeah, at least some ideas of like health information. And it's also interesting because it was genome focused that my career there was almost evenly split by the announcement of the completion of the human genome. So that what I did there was very different before that and after that. It's a big thing, but it was always changing. And Millennium was great, but Millennium also had a strict no social media policy. So you weren't supposed to have any social media about the company, about any of our collaborators, any of our competitors, any of our vendors, et cetera, et cetera. Um, and so that was kind of inhibiting. And then the other part of it is, yeah, there were some bloggers, and there were a couple I followed, and particularly Derek Lowe with his In the Pipeline, which he has remained amazing over a very long period, and he's very much better than I am about posting daily. Fascinating content. So I was like, this is something I'd like to do. And one of the other bits of it was I enjoyed I have enjoyed working in companies. I've worked in companies now since 1996, but a lot of times in companies, it depends on the company, but particularly the culture at Millennium is you write a lot of PowerPoints. You're always writing PowerPoints, or nowadays it's Google Slides, or pick your favorite thing. But you're writing in that format. You're writing bullets. You're writing, doing elaborate figures sometimes with captions, but you're not doing long form writing. And I kind of missed that. I missed doing as a graduate student writing scientific papers or writing things internally, I missed that opportunity. And so I was like, wow, if I ever get out of here, I think I'll start one of these blog things. It doesn't seem so bad. And so then, almost exactly on my 10th anniversary, Millennium was going through a large restructuring and they laid me off. So I get this layoff notice. In fact, the kind of comedy of it is I got the layoff notice officially on I think I was officially notified on Thursday, and on Saturday I got this email saying, "Congratulations for 10 years of service." So, the two hands weren't talking to each other so well. And I was like, okay, I'm going to start a blog now so that the next employer has to tell me to stop. So this is a stake in the ground, and yeah, maybe the next employer is going to have a similar attitude towards it, but they have to tell me to stop. They can't prevent me from starting. Plus, also, I wasn't sure how I was going to get a job quickly. Uh, how long was that going to take? It was a little nervous, so it's like, okay, here's a way to advertise myself too. So yeah, the first month and so, a few months, I was really good about writing pretty frequently, and trying to figure out what I want to do. So some were more like a journal club, some were more like commentary on industry or on my experiences and so forth. And yeah, and over time, it's evolved some, but that's basically what it is. I mean, sometimes I do something that's more like a journal club, and I go into a paper or a presentation and dig into it deeply. Some of it is commentary on news or even breaking news. So once I did this for a while, PR folks at companies started sending me emails saying, would you be interested in being under embargo? And we're gonna announce, this thing, and we'll give you information, and you can write up beforehand. I was like, oh, cool, because this was also like I was the editor of the high school newspaper. I've always had this, I've read newspapers since I was growing up. I've always had this kind of interest in journalism. And so it's like, ooh, I get to be kind of a pretend journalist.
I
So
love it.
yeah, so that's it. So it's been fun, and yeah, it's a little erratic. It does require putting time in and some discipline of writing. And one of my other initial rules was it should never spend any money on it. I break that a little bit, but I never spend really serious money. It is a hobby, um, and yeah, sometimes it's just there are stuff I start writing and I haven't finished. In fact, there's one thing in particular. There was a major news item in November that I got really like. I have multiple drafts that I didn't like that didn't weren't complete either, and then I had my personal life kind of intrude in a major way, and I really need to get back to it because it was such a big news event. So, which is Clive Brown leaving Oxford Nanopore and just reflecting on everything he's done there. Uh, so yeah, that's like in the list of things I need to. There's a bunch of other kind of like unfinished stuff. Uh, there's always like my ideas list. I'm not good about writing them all up. But that's one since the London Calling Conference is coming up soon. And if I recall correctly, you and I first met at one of the New York Nanopore community meetings. So you know how interesting those can be, and yeah, it's going to be a big deal. London Calling without Clive being part of the company, and it's a complicated time for Oxford too. So, but anyway, yeah, that's one of the things I always feel guilty about. It's like all the things that I meant to write and never quite got around to.
Understood completely. No, but even in that perspective of how you started things, there's a couple of things I think worth uh, pulling on a little bit there.
Sure.
One, you mentioned in 2006 something that already feels so dated in a company having a social media
Yeah.
policy of no social media. Like that just sounds bizarre at this point in the age of social media and people having their own professional accounts or even personal accounts at large,
Yeah.
being able to highlight their companies and everything else in between, to now what we're seeing that social media accounts are reaching out to you or other employees along the way, making their name for themselves and commenting not only on other companies themselves as well. But what a time to get into the blog
Yeah.
space.
No, it's a good point. Like things have changed really dramatically. Of course, social media has evolved a lot. In those days, a lot of it was like Yahoo message boards. I think their biggest worry is they were a public company. They did not want anyone, uh, you know, releasing material information or somehow doing something that would get in trouble. But there were, like, even at that time, there were some companies that were embracing social media, or at least would have people embracing social media. Yeah, it's interesting, and you see now the latest, of course, with today's big news outside of biotech, for the most part,
Yeah.
being the election of the Pope. And yeah, immediately people are digging up his old tweets and seeing what he last reposted and trying to get an idea on who is this guy from it. So yeah, it's kind of it was a really different time.
Yeah.
And
And can I ask something you mentioned
sure,
there that, in your 10 years, a millennium, with that restriction on being able to have a blog, but you mentioned that, you were maybe writing things internally that were short form or slide deck
yeah,
format, but you didn't have that focus on long form essays, which I agree with you with, by the way. Even in my own personal life, I love writing mini form essays, even just as reflection of what I've done. That could be both professional or personal, because I see something about teasing out the ideas, getting something structured in a narrative where I can look back and map my thoughts to over time. So I hear that, but what about on your end whenever you do that practice? What pushed you to make that public?
yeah, and it was also like another decision that was in there was should I be anonymous or not?
Mm,
And I
mm.
and this kind of thing's popped up a few more times on social media, and I've basically always a very long time ago, I had an anonymous account, something that most people don't even probably know. Once existed when the first social media for biotech was called Biotech Rumor Mill, and I only posted like twice on it, I think. But I've just generally decided that yeah, I'm going to out myself so quickly. Let's just cut to the chase. Uh, but yeah, it was the writing in public because yeah, I could have just written to myself, and I think some of it is I wanted the feedback. I mean, some of it is yeah.
Mm.
I've always had a little bit of a showman in me, a little bit of wanting to get some attention. Well, let's be upfront about that. But also the feedback, I think is the big thing. I wanted out of that, and I enjoy getting as long as it's constructive. I enjoy getting positive and negative feedback about things like this makes sense, this doesn't. I mean, the other one, which I'm not sure I'd quite crystallize in my head, but it does mean sometimes people reach out to me and give me juicy. I didn't imagine. I never imagined like the companies coming to me and saying, "Oh, here we're going to have a press release. You want to write it up and release when it comes out." But I, maybe I imagine a little bit. It has been useful. I mean, sometimes people send me very interesting tips. Like people will message me on all the different platforms or at conferences or so forth. And it's like, okay, off the record, and then they'll give me some juicy bit of information about the industries. Things like, for example, one person came up to me. This isn't that something I feel like I have to keep secret, saying that they were at one of these companies. I forget which of the two. There were two companies in the early part of the last decade that were trying to develop. Actually, there were three electron microscopy based DNA sequencing. At least three. There were three I knew about. So the idea would be you basically deposit DNA almost unbroken, like entire chromosomes was the goal, on X-ray grids, and you would somehow label the bases on it. That was a lot of the tricky part because your standard X-rays are kind of monochromatic. So how do you get around that? And you would read these very long sequences, and that was the dream. And one of those companies, someone came, emailed me, got in touch with me, and said, "Yeah, we got totally killed by Oxford Nanopore's AGBT announcement in 2012. Like killed in the sense that they need it to do fundraising, and everyone's like, no, Oxford's going to own this space. Forget it." So that was a really interesting insight into that. I mean, there's other times I can't think of one offhand, but I'm pretty sure I have gotten messages that say, "Yeah, look, I couldn't comment on this publicly, but you're way off the mark." Which especially when they come up with what to back it up with, is, it's definitely really interesting. It helps me shape things. I guess a lot of it is I've always wanted the kind of back and forth, give and take, polite but very honest disagreement on facts and on where some of these are going. I mean, sometimes it is opinions, and my opinion is just different than someone because we put different weights on things. But it's still interesting to evaluate what someone else is thinking about it, but particularly on the factual basis. Because the one thing I've learned at different times is no matter how much you think you know about any of these sequencing platforms, there's always more details. And like in another one, so when I'm at Ginkgo Bioworks in 2020 during the pandemic, we first launched SARS-CoV-2 viral sequencing, and that ended up growing into a major thing. At least at one point, we're the largest generator in the U.S. of SARS-CoV-2 sequences. Kind of after the pandemic peaked. Part of that was a lot of other companies that had been doing a lot got out of it. But we also tried unsuccessfully to develop a high throughput mass scale diagnostics platform using sequencing. And one of the things in there is like, I thought I knew it was going to be on Illumina NovaSeq, and I thought I knew the platform in many ways. I always knew there were details. But boy, when you start really, especially this was a part of the issue was this assay was really sensitive to things like index hopping and some other things that can go on. And then you start getting into like the really nitty gritty details about those platforms. And the things like someone says, "Oh, I sequenced it on Illumina," and most of the time that's fine. But of course, there's times you want to know: did you sequence 2-color or 4-color? And which way did the index? If you go through, Illumina has this funny thing where they keep changing. They basically oscillate between two different ways of how they do the paired end switch, and as part of that, read the one index. And it's just this fascinating. Most of the time you don't need to know, you don't need to care, but it's kind of cool when you get into these like crazy details and how some of the other stuff that's just. I mean, the other thing I just love about sequencing is so much of this is well, actually. So another like anecdote is, as an undergraduate at University of Delaware, I went into uh, my favorite professor's office hours one day, and I had been trying to get Sanger sequencing to work, and without much luck. Well, we were very successful at sequencing the M13 control. We never got a really useful data from what we were interested in. Uh, and I said to him, I said, I can't believe how slow sequencing is. Of course, he immediately gave the obvious rejoinder, which is, I can't believe how fast it is. Because, of course, his career spanned before any DNA sequencing existed. Like, when he was a grad student, I think some of the early RNA sequencing, which again is one of these interesting things, that RNA sequencing actually came before DNA sequencing, but the method that was used didn't scale. Eventually, reverse transcriptase is discovered, DNA sequencing advances, so everyone forgets about RNA sequencing for decades, and then Oxford Nanopore brings back actually sequencing RNA without converting it to cDNA. Uh, but yeah, I remember having that conversation with him, and he's like, I met up with him once after he retired. Um, it was just but yeah, with sequencing, like some of me wants to be able to go back. I wish I'd thought the time I chatted with him is like, can you believe what we can do now? Because it's not only just sequencing, but he was a biochemistry professor. So if you think about PacBio, in PacBio, you're running literally millions. You're watching millions of single polymerase DNA polymerases synthesize in real time, so you can watch like the kinetics of it, and that's just like and then you go into, and I don't fully understand it because I just don't have the physics background. How a zero mode waveguide works, and it's it is this thing that it's a quantum phenomenon. If you think about it from a standpoint of classical Newtonian physics, it should not work. I mean, you're interrogating with light a volume which is smaller than the wavelength of the light. Again, I'm not a physicist. Any physicists want to dispute me that, oh yeah, sure, we can explain that with Newtonian, please do so. I'd love to understand these things better. I mean, a similar one, someone posted, there's this Discord ASIC set up by Nava Whiteford, who's an amazing guy. Does all sorts of fascinating uh, dives into sequencing technology and has a different background than I do. So we often, I think, complement each other in many ways, because he knows a lot more about the physics in particular, but also the physics and the chemistry and electronics and all that, which I'm just not very useful in. Um, uh, but over in the ASIC Discord, someone posted a patent from an up and coming uh, genome sequencing company, really early stage. Uh, they've only made like a couple presentations, but they had a patent. Another interesting thing, they were in Australia, so it's company called Swan Genomics, and uh, and yeah, you look at it and it involves plasmons. I'm like, boy, I mean, I run into plasmons periodically because they show up in all sorts of instruments based on that stuff. Do I understand what a plasmon is and how they work and what the math is, and especially things like how does that affect signals? Like how does it attenuate? Oh hell no. I do not understand what a plasmon is. I don't understand really what a zero mode waveguide is. Uh, the way nanopores work, I kind of understand, but it's also, in the end, it is a bit of hand waving, as we would say back in my graduate program, of somehow, the Oxford has tuned the interior surface of their nanopore, and the DNA is interacting with it, and that somehow modulates current going through, and in the end, you throw it into a black box machine learning algorithm and figure out what the hell all that means, because it's not like it's not like some sequencing technologies, basically every other one on the planet, where you can sit down on a piece of paper and work out how exactly how a given base generates a given signal. But and then there's the other things, like there's the way you could imagine PacBio works, and then there's the way they've actually implemented, which has some key differences, and things like it's basically the dwell of the nucleotide by the polymerase that is your signal, and as a result, they have these weird like dendrimer like structures that have many nucleotides on them. And they're all tied together somehow. I blogged about this a long time ago. This is one where they gave me a advanced heads up on, um, and some of that's also because, of course, what's the issues with it? Like with all of these, what's the Achilles heel of some of these technologies, because they are witchcraft. um, uh, PacBio, it's photo damage. So they've had to do a lot of work on photo damage. And one of the best ways to avoid photo damage is to get that fluorophore as far as possible away from your polymerase, so that if it does, generate, I think it's singlet oxygen or free radical somehow, there's a lot of molecules between that and your polymerase, so it's more likely to do something else. And of course, there's all sorts, PacBio's buffer and all is, presumably has all sorts of interesting additives in it to deal with singlet, with free radicals and singlet oxygen and all that. But yeah, it's always been interesting. Like another one is I got talking to Ion Torrent very early on. I remember going to this conference in Providence, Rhode Island, which was close. That was one reason I went. It was pretty convenient. And Jonathan Rothberg was on there, and this is before Ion Torrent he was at Ion Torrent, but they hadn't really revealed anything. And as he's going through this thing, and then finally I look at my watch and go, oh, damn it. He's not actually going to reveal anything. We're out of time. It's just this big hype build-up. But eventually, I got talking to them. They gave me some pre-interviews. And I ended up doing a News and Views article in Nature Biotechnology when they published their technology in there. And I tried to be somewhat upbeat, but largely level. Especially that kind of a format. And one of the things that, they always said they were going to be able to scale because they're working on semiconductors. And it was always like, I don't think it's the semiconductors that'll really be the issue. It's the biochemistry. And eventually you're going to get like crosstalk between wells. And of course, it was a combination of things that finally killed their scaling, why they never got to their advanced chips. I think some of it turned out actually the electronics was getting, not so much electronics, getting all the data off. Since the thing basically generates data in real time, that is a key difference between, if you look at different platforms, like Illumina has this huge advantage of time. You have this stable signal, so you can just take your time to photograph it however you want to, because it ain't going nowhere. Obviously, time, because of the cyclic process, you take too long, your process gets too long. That has issues. But to some degree, you have this luxury of time, whereas PacBio, Oxford Nanopore, Ion Torrent, 454 in some ways was the worst, is like, your signal happens and you catch it or you don't. So you've got to you've got to build a system and you've got to think about everything, especially pulling data out of the system that is all tuned with the fact that you do not have a stable signal. It is very transient. So
I gotta stop you there. Just on that train of thought. No, it's perfect, because what I was asking there is why you chose to go public with your long form essays. And right. in that I'm so thankful that you do, because in what you just spoke about there, I think what we're seeing is the level of exposure you have to the field, not only in your role in academia, your 10 years at Millennium, involvement in the biotech space in general, but your curiosity has taken you to, some of those nuanced backdoor conversations of details that we all really care about and don't always have access to. So being able to bring that up to the surface and let people know, just where your curiosity is taking you, that have really significant impacts on people's day-to-day work. Not only maybe some of which is going to be on that investment side, as you spoke about, with VCs trying to keep track of the technology trends, but also labs who are looking to, hey, I have to make a CapEx decision here on which sequencer I want to double down on, which is going to be the most relevant for the type of data I have. You're not always going to see it on the slide deck marketing material, or maybe even in the controlled presentations, whereas I think what Omics allows and it shines light on is some of the technical nuances there in a way that I think you've done really successfully. And you're not, touting one particular technology, nor are you really trashing. I don't think you ever have that hypercritical tone. Rather, it's laid out. Hey, these are the opinions of Keith, and this is my best guess at it. And the journalist component is really interesting that you spoke about, because I think a phenomenon we've all seen now, especially in the sciences, is journalism has its amazing impact on people's lives. But then it's funny whenever you see a story on your specialty and you see all the holes and gaps in understanding and the ways in which they have to gloss over certain details that you feel are very significant. Whereas, you come from the technical community, and actually those little details are the things that you care to hone in on and highlight the most.
Yeah, so yeah, I mean that's a good point. Like it's something whenever I read any kind of a history of something I lived through, something I was really involved in, it's like, yeah, it wasn't quite like that. And sometimes it's a matter of how they emphasize it, and others are like, yeah, I remember this really differently. Some of the perspective, like Kevin Davies has this great book on uh, there's Genome Wars, and that talks about the race for the genome, and Millennium gets very little coverage in there, which is probably appropriate. But the little bit is like, maybe there should have been a little more. But of course, yeah, I am a little partisan there. Uh, but yeah, it is always interesting, and I think we as a society we benefit a lot from having many different viewpoints. I mean, you'd like to have ideally as unbiased as possible. I don't think anyone can be completely unbiased, but you also can avoid being radically biased. But also, again, these different like technical and experience ones. So you think of the different some of the other bloggers in the genomic space. I mentioned Nava, and he has really technical, especially on the electronics, software, some of those things that he can look at an electron micrograph and make the circuit make sense of it. I can't. You look at Dale Yuzuki, who comes from more of a marketing background. He really understands the science, but his profession is sales and marketing. So he's really thinking in terms, and he has a lot of experience at a lot of different companies. He's seen, he's kind of seen it all. He's seen all these different angles. And so he's really thinking about, and some of the sales and marketing, but also things like product life cycles. And in particular, I mean, it's easy, and probably from my background, like my father, I would kind of, maybe have started out with a dim view of sales and marketing. It's like, good products don't need sales and marketing, right? They just sell themselves. This is science. We don't need sales and marketing. But, the reality is that there are good technical solutions that sometimes fail in marketplaces because they aren't marketed well. They aren't aimed, especially like that last bit of tuning, that last bit of fitting things into the market isn't done well, or things like 454 might have had more lifespan in the market, but they didn't move to the right place fast enough because they didn't realize we need to get there or we're dead. Uh, so yeah, so Dale brings that, and like Brian Kruger he brings in some amazing history of science stuff, which occasionally, of course, I nitpick a little bit, but I mean he does great stuff. I subscribe to his newsletter, and he brings in all sorts of interesting things. And again, he has he's been in the diagnostics world for a long time, and diagnostics is very I've dabbled in diagnostics a little bit, but diagnostics is definitely a really different perspective on a lot of things of what you value and what you value, what you value more, what you value less than say more of a research environment like a synthetic biology company like Ginkgo, or even a drug discovery company like Warp Drive or Infinity or Millennium. They're just there's different value propositions there, and it's going to affect your choices on technology and what you're looking for in a technology. And of course, it's also just whenever I read things, and like James Hadfield hasn't written a whole lot, but lately, but he still writes, and he probably in some ways has a background rather similar to mine in a number of ways. Of course, it's different, but it's always like that was especially fun is when used to be a lot more of it, but it still happens. Like multiple of us, Sean Baker would be another one, like with the Roche SBX announcement, a bunch of us wrote on it. And I always make a point to finish my piece before I read anyone else's because I don't want to accidentally plagiarize. But then I have a lot of fun reading what everyone else wrote and saying, I didn't even think to ask that question. Or,
It's awesome.
wow, he really dug deeper into this than I did. Or, and it's a learning experience. I mean, hopefully, in many cases, it's going to affect how I think about things the next time. It's certainly going to affect how, if someone asks me, "Oh, what do you think about Roche?" It's like, well, there's what I wrote, but there's also what Sean wrote, and there's what Nava wrote, and so forth. Uh, and I love that community. I love that back and forth, and uh, just because I think we all, and any other writers out there, you just when you have that opportunity to work with other talented individuals who know the space, ask interesting questions, and write well. Matt Herper who's a professional journalist, used to, I used to compare what he wrote about Illumina and what I did, wrote about Illumina or Ion Torrent. But when you do that and you look at that and you I have a competitive edge. I'm the youngest of three sons, and pretty competitive. Um, but mostly it's so sometimes I'm like, yeah, well, I got this, but mostly I'm trying to like, okay, how can I do better? What do I like about their writing that maybe could reflect on mine? Another thing, like the one that I just will never ever touch is Brian Kruger is so good with memes, and he always has a hilarious, well-known, and totally on target meme with almost every one of his posts, or maybe it's every other one of his LinkedIn posts, and I'm just like, damn, it's like I just don't know them well enough. It's like, and that is the modern way of communicating, isn't it? It's like memes, podcasts, and it's like maybe once a quarter I think of a good meme to
I,
use on something. I'm just not wired that way, and I'm so jealous.
Yeah, but saying that, something across the medium of this blog space or social media, it's cool because it offers an outlet of personal expression to a lot of the
Yeah,
scientific
yeah,
community as well. And like, I remember some of your articles being like, even this year, I think you did one that was like a Mission Impossible message or
yeah. Oh
something
yeah, yeah.
for
That was
methylation.
fun.
So how are you balancing that component or is it just something you're having fun with and then just ensuring there's scientific accuracy along the way?
Yeah, that was. I mean, that was one, and it's. I walk for my exercise, and one of those people keeps track of their steps, and I have a dog, so that helps with that. And sometimes, when I'm out walking, my mind goes all over the place. And that was one. I don't know what. I don't know. I think I was thinking about the methylation thing and this whole like, how could Roche get the fifth one? And then it was like somehow like the Mission Impossible idea like crept in, and I was like, ooh, this could be fun. How can I run with this? Um, yeah, every now and I mean, I don't do that a lot because I'm just not clever enough. Um, but that was a hell of a lot of fun to write. It
It,
really was. And I'd like to try to figure that out. I mean, the main one, yeah. I mean, in our family, we were big wordplay and puns were a common thing in conversation. So yeah, I write a lot of punny titles, some of which may be too inside jokes for people to get, which is a problem. But yeah, that's. I need to think because I got a lot of positive response. Because you could always say like, "Oh, come on, kid, you just can't do this." But no, people seem to like the Mission Impossible one, and that's certainly not going to be a regular thing. But yeah, if I can think about that. I think it is also just kind of fun sometimes. I've written ones in the past. Like there was one I wrote on when Illumina brought out the iSeq, and a lot of people were. I wasn't entirely sure what would happen. I think Illumina really kind of launched that and then didn't do much with it for the longest time. But how are you going to use that? And so I wrote something from the whole perspective of here's a small company, and you know this is a garage biotech, and this is why we're going to buy that instrument. I think I kind of wrote it. I tried to get it from that, kind of first mythical first person perspective, or make up a character. But yeah, it is something I need to think about more often. Is like
yeah.
how can I work that out? I mean, like another one that was kind of fun. It was also a different sort of creativity, but there was someone who was communicating with a bunch online, and they were coming from more of a finance background. They were very interested in like the genome and kind of the history of the genome project. And I wrote this, and I think at the time I was also more into reading alternative history. So these, people write books. You always have this, what if this happened? And then, okay, what if we follow that thread? And some people are better at it than others. I think it works better in short stories, as an aside. But anyway, I wrote this like series of alternative histories because I think one of the things about the genome project as it was executed is there were a lot of decisions involved there. There were major decisions that are now kind of swept under the rug. We get this kind of like this sanitized history of deciding to sequence human genome. There was a bit of a race with Celera. Everybody finished. Uh, or like another one that just kind of irritates me because I have a lot of admiration for Celera. They did amazing stuff. They advanced the area of genome assembly, bioinformatics, far ahead. But they always make this claim that they didn't need the public project at all, and I'm like, yeah, your genome would have been a lot less valuable without it because the public project did the things like map all these markers to cytogenetic bands and map all these markers to classic genetic maps and all these other things that was one of the we often talk about, oh, we got to sequence the genome. super valuable. But a lot of it also was the fact that it tied together all these other resources that were out there. Again, in my opinion, tied together these other resources that are out there so that geneticists, no matter what they were working on, could tie everything into the human genome. It literally became this like common map for everything. Whereas if you'd just done the sequencing without doing some of these other things, it would be like, well, the geneticists would have been like, yeah, that doesn't do me a lot of good. And also the way the original human genome, it was a bit fragmented. Uh, you're like, well, I have a contig. I don't know where it goes, but I have it. I mean, to a rough degree, and that was one of the things the public project did. Kind of another every now and then, especially in like the first decade after that, I would start you start wondering about there's some of the technologies that the original human genome project used that basically that's the only thing they were ever used for. Like they really were like one shot. The technology went beyond that. And every now and then at Infinity Pharmaceuticals, which I was at for a couple years, like 2008, 2011, 2009, 2011, we started trying to revive one of the things that was kind of from the Human Genome Project, really from even before that, like a really classical technique, because we thought for a problem it might work. But it was frustrating because it was like, oh, this would be so easy if we could just get the resources from the Human Genome Project. And it turned out, yeah, most of them were probably had been discarded. So it's like, it's kind of like if you look at other like different mega projects. I mean, it's almost like like when the tunnel was dug. There's a machine that dug it. It's buried. It's at the end. It's still underground. The tunnel boring machine. There's no value. No one wanted to bring this basically worn out piece of equipment up, so they just burrowed a little further and left it there. Uh, the U.S. space program. There's all sorts of things that were built for the Apollo missions that test vehicles and so forth that were never used again. Genome Project's no different than that. There's just, but it was always interesting to. It's fun to think about some of those things, and also especially to think about some of the technology choices. What were other options? And there was an aspect, and I came out of George Church's lab, and George was a big believer that you should just keep that the Genome Project should wait until there were really, really good sequencing tools, and then should go sequence the project, go sequence the genome. And what won out was more of a, okay, the tools are just good enough. It's going to be expensive, but it's going to be so valuable to get that genome. So let's just go and do it. And I think in the end that was the right decision, but there could have been other funding decisions, other decisions that would say, no, let's pour the money into tech development. And it is interesting. Like if you look at the germ, during that time that the Human Genome Project was going into high gear, say the 1995 to 2000, 2001, that's when the germ of 454, of Illumina, of solid technology, of PacBio, of Nanopore, they were all the ideas were being worked on in that time period. So that it's not, there's a lot of reasons to think that, well, they still would have taken a very long time. And especially like Illumina really benefited from having a reference genome, any kind of short read platform. And of course, the long read platforms weren't going to be long read platforms right away. They, both Nanopore and PacBio had to go a little while before they got to really long reads. But it is interesting. Like, what is this parallel universe where the Human Genome Project decided, call it discipline, to decide that we're going to wait until we can sequence genomes cheaply, and then we'll sequence them. And it's like, well, on the one hand, maybe the whole genome project would have gotten done later. Maybe it would have gotten done for less money. And all the benefits of having it done would have been delayed. This is probably the worst of it. But it isn't entirely clear that it would have been a terrible thing. The other, kind of interesting thing with all that, just thinking about it, of course, is that initial human genome, which again, Millennium, we leapt on, we did all sorts of work on. It was this huge shock. Like, like one of the big things is, when I was a undergrad or grad student somewhere, people started throwing on how many genes are in the genome. And if you went into almost any textbook, if it said it would say 50,000. One of my colleagues at Millennium got really interested in that. Because part of it was all these genome companies are out there. So there's Human Genome Sciences and Insight and a bunch of others I've forgotten. And they'd be like, "Oh no, we've been doing all this cDNA sequencing, but today we'd call RNA-seq, they called EST." And you think about the scale was just these days laughable. So like in Millennium, we were really excited to generate 100,000 reads out of one RNA-seq library, um, one EST library. But they'd be like, "No, there's not 50,000. There's 100,000 genes. No, there's not 100,000 genes. There's 150,000 genes." I think it got up to 200,000 for someone. And of course, some of that was uh, there was value in them estimating it higher. If you're building a genetic database, your database is more valuable if there's more genes in there. And I had this colleague at Millennium who got interested in this, and the Human Genome Project was not very far along. So this is probably like 94, 95. And he wrote this long form report. Again, this is one of those things like kind of in the back of my head later when I started the blog that I really enjoyed Tom's report. And Tom Barnes, who went on to be a CSO at some gene therapy companies. And he had this logic about Drosophila and these other things. He's like, I think the number of genes is going to be closer to 20 to 25,000. And I read it through and I'm like, Tom, I can't put my thumb on it. You're wrong. You're obviously wrong. It's got to be higher. There's no way humans have that few genes. Of course, Tom was right. And there was this whole like betting pool that you and Bernie, I think, was running. Um, and I think almost nobody bet down in that range. Like there were very few bets down that 20,000 neighborhood. Uh, and of course, yeah, the other thing, that initial human genome more or less said there's that many genes. But of course, we know now that there were a lot of mistakes in it. It was still, this watershed moment, but it wasn't really till basically 2020 or 2021 that we first started seeing telomere to telomere genomes and truly everything right. And there's some really difficult parts of the genome to get right. Um, and I had nothing to do with any of that, but it was interesting to watch all of that as these new technologies came on that were just again couldn't really be dreamed of or barely dreamed of. Some people were dreaming of them, but they were not available when the Genome Project's done. I mean, another one like optical mapping, so BioNano, which became another important part of this T2T effort. That also, I think I heard. I think I heard a. This, I have to check. I think I'm wrong. I heard a talk by the inventor of optical mapping when I was an undergraduate. I think the optical mapping itself didn't start till a bit later, but it's still in that like back in the last century that these technologies started emerging, but there was a lot to do. Like another one, which I forget whether I ever actually wrote. I was going to write, but kind of interesting is this. Thinking about this technology, genomics tech is so interdisciplinary. So you think about any of these, and it is this question of was it even possible for, say, Illumina sequencing to emerge in 1990? And I think the general answer is no. That even if, say, the biochemistry, I mean, by just like tweaking one thing, if someone gets the idea for doing how you do Illumina chemistry in 1990, well, the compute wouldn't be able to deal with like the compute requirements of that and the imaging requirements and all that, or it just would have been so insanely expensive that that omics technology, so many of them are optical. Of course, there are exceptions, and have benefited from this just crazy price drop in imaging equipment. It's like like a personal story. My father was very into photography at different times, and this probably would have been in the '90s sometime, or maybe early 2000. He was conservative about going from film to digital. And when his performance demands on digital were really difficult. So every now and then when I'd see him, I would ask, so have you thought about going to digital? Because of course this must have been 2000 because I'd gone to a digital camera for doing family snapshots. And he's like, so the one time he says, oh yeah, I finally see a camera uh, that I like, and I forget how he phrased it. But I was like, oh wait, you mean like he said something about 25. I was like, 2,500? He's like, no. The camera he wanted was 25K. I was like, you want to do it? He did, of course, didn't do it. He was a little tight with his money. Um, but of course, nowadays, I don't know exactly what camera he's talking about. I'm sure one of the cameras, I have a camera or two, uh, probably greatly exceeds that, and I would never ever spend 25K on a camera. I'd probably spend less than 10%, well less than 10% on the camera, and it's just because the sensor technologies, for so long, like on cell phones, it's like, oh, our cell phone has a 1 megapixel camera, and then it was 2 megapixel, four, and then what? We're up to like 25 or something. Uh, and so yeah, cameras got super cheap, and then the compute. Like if you imagine, suppose I dropped these huge image files. Uh, you know, like another way to think about it, just disk storage. Just think of how that's changed. That when I went to college, I got a PC and it had a 10 megabyte hard drive, and I thought, what am I going to do with 10 megabytes? Because there were no image files, there were no sound files, and it was just text. But of course, eventually you fill it up with games and text, reports and so forth. But then, like when I was a grad student, they got tired of me filling up communal drives, so they gave me a 500 megabyte. This always sounds ridiculous when I say it, but I'm pretty sure it was a 500 megabyte, a half terabyte drive to be all my own. And again, it seemed like at the beginning of my grad career seemed like ridiculous amounts of space, and by the end, of course, I was constantly having to do housekeeping to keep things under control. Uh, but yeah, you start thinking about that, like an Illumina run, even say on a MySeq, starts generating ridiculous amounts of data. Uh, the sequel to, which is now nowhere near the highest performance PacBio, if you just export the base calls, the non-hi-fi data, but it's still base calls. They've converted it from images. It's like a terabyte if you have a good library. It's somewhere between a half terabyte and a terabyte. And yeah, like in the 90s, like the idea of just moving those kinds of data around would just give most IT people hives. It just this was just it was crazy. I mean, your fiber wouldn't take you forever. The networks couldn't handle it. You didn't have the drives routinely to handle it. And so yeah, imagine you like time machine all the like idea for Illumina back to someone in 1990. They're like, what the hell do I do with this? I get, I need to buy this like $1 million camera and several $1 million worth of compute and with dedicated people to run it. It's probably still not going to work. And then of course there's all the biochemistry, the
Fluid
microfluidics and
dynamics. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
all the stuff. So yeah, it's always interesting. I mean, probably some of these advances could have come a bit sooner with more funding and so forth. But some of them, they just, because it's so interdisciplinary and it's cutting edge in most of these techs, yeah, you kind of needed to wait until they all got to a certain point before you could envision any of these technologies we're looking at today.
But this is exactly why I love having this conversation, Keith. And again, getting back to the conversations of the value of blogs and journalists in the field, because we're in a science, but there's such a human component to it. And there's almost
Yeah,
a historical component to it of how it gets written down, how we actually exist because of the confluences of different advances in the fields of chemistry, photography, and genetic sciences. That's what's actually propelled the different technologies that we use at a daily basis. And again, you've mentioned some really great writers in the field. I want to make sure I include those in the show notes. And there was a bunch too, I think in like 2010s ish era where
yeah,
it was like in vogue to have a blog. Like Stephen Turner, I followed his Getting Genetics
yeah,
Done. Nick Lohman used to be a pretty prolific writer in
yeah,
the space,
yeah,
especially the early Oxford days. I used to follow them. Torsten Seaman over there again in Australia.
yeah,
And so again,
yeah,
you're seeing the human component. You're seeing people just opine with all the various perspectives that they have to just add texture to what we're doing, add context to the advancements that are happening. It reminds me, you talked about that story where you were an undergrad talking about the slowness of sequencing. You gave it to a
yeah,
professor, and he was able to say, like, this is rapid. Let me give you some
yeah,
context. So I think that's what some of these conversations on the podcast, be it blogs or otherwise, offer is more context to what's happening. But that
yeah,
said, I do want to talk a little bit about the science and the sequencing.
yeah,
Like there's been
sure.
another revolution of sequencing companies, maybe 2022, 2023. If you
Yeah.
want to speak to that, I think that, again, another
Yeah.
confluence of happenings from patents expiring, VC interests, advances in technology. But, we've seen now singular Element, Ultima, etc.
Yeah.
And you've been covering them all.
Yeah, no, it's so it is interesting that apparently there was a big round of financing by VCs, and some of these like ultimately kind of almost annoyed me, but I'm impressed by them how they stayed completely off my radar until they approached me. So and they even like and we found out through them and now it's been repeated others that like the Broad has actually like basically secret labs where they will test out equipment uh, for people. But yeah, it was interesting, and I think for some of those companies, like Singular in particular, probably was not expecting Element to launch around the same time with more or less the same business plan, which is I mean, Singular's had a lot of bad luck, and that didn't help matters. But I think it has been interesting, and I think Illumina. There was even like one of the other aspects of it was Illumina has these local like user meetings, and Boston being a big area for it. Uh, and I used to go to them pretty religiously, and I remember at one of them, it was over in Kendall Square, and one of the Illumina reps said to me, and he didn't say this is off the record, but it was, you know, they recognized they had won. They'd beaten 454, they'd beaten Solid. At that time, BGI was patent litigation blocked from coming in. Complete Genomic, well, which had been Complete Genomics. And Oxford and PacBio existed, but they were these little niche things.
So what year are you speaking right now?
I'm trying to think, when would have this been? It's probably like 2017, 2016,
Mm.
around there.
So before the surge of new companies we've
Well,
seen.
exactly. And he commented, he's like, he was worried that Illumina would go soft without competition. That they needed, that having vanquished the field, it was not a good thing long term for Illumina.
Oh, wait a
Which I
minute.
think was,
Can
yeah,
I comment on that? It's an interesting time though about the competition side because around that time is when Illumina PacBio merger got blocked
that's
because of the
true.
lack of conversation or competition
Competition.
conversation.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and that's a whole other, kind of interesting story how PacBio's had its ups and downs. Um, but yeah, so apparently around that time, a bunch of VCs decided that it was worth funding some of these companies and coming out. And I think you're right. I think, on the patent side, the one way I've looked at it, I don't like reading patents. I have done it periodically for some of these patents. I don't do it, and I will skim them. But especially trying to figure out what patents actually cover, leave that to patent lawyers. It's really hard. And especially like figuring out prior art, it's just a nightmare because of the way you kind of contain patents and so forth. But I think the one thing on the patents is, yeah, a bunch of Illumina's original IP was expiring, and to me, what that just means is, because this is the problem with patents, is I might think I have an idea that lies outside of someone else's patent, but as long as that patent exists, they might claim I'm not actually outside that. They might threaten me with litigation. They might litigate it. Once patents expired, all that risk goes away. So I do wonder a bit if some of this investment was just recognizing that some of the foundational patents were expiring, and that just meant it wasn't necessarily that they were going. There weren't none of these were like a MySeq clone. As an aside, I'm kind of surprised no one's tried to build a MySeq clone. Presumably, essentially all the IP on MySeq is dead. Uh, or something else. Like it is interesting. You don't quite have nobody's business model, and maybe it's just still too damn expensive and such. But no one's business model is to build like a clone or just use everything off patent and just launch something like that. But yeah, to have these companies, it probably took some of the risk out of the equation, and then you did have these interesting different ideas, and you have these very different backgrounds. So like Molly Hay of Element is I actually collaborated with her when she was at Illumina. She was in the protein engineering group there, and Warp Drive had a bit of a collaboration, uh, looking at some of the transposases that she'd engineered to try to get some of this, make them even less specific than native TN5. Uh, and so I knew she came from that background of like, you know, really good hardcore science, but also had been immersed in Illumina and so forth. I don't know a lot about the Singular background, but I think some of the technology came out of one of the Swedish academics. And then you have, Ultima, where a lot of the key leadership comes out of the semiconductor industry, which I always find interesting. There's always a huge value to people coming out of another field. There's also, of course, some risk that they'll, overlook some things that are that you know to their detriment. I don't think Ultima's done that, but there's always a risk. When someone moves from one field to another, they bring this radical new perspective. There's this advantage to not knowing all the rules because some of those rules don't apply. But of course, there's a disadvantage that some of those rules might be really pretty damn important. Like the collective wisdom of the field, some of it may be myths that just need to be or blinders that have on, but sometimes they're really important. But everything Ultima, and so yeah, you see like Ultima brought out this really radically different architecture for
The
how you
wafer.
would do sequencing, at least at the hardware level. The
Yeah.
biochemistry,
Sequence by
draws on a bunch of
synthesis.
these other
Yeah.
things. Uh, Elements, they've really focused on, they emphasize the surface of their flow cell. I mean, in the end, it is four-color sequencing. They've also, both Element and, of course, uh, what PacBio was developing is Onso. I'm just blanking on the name of the company now. Have this, this interesting slight twist on sequencing by synthesis, where they do the signal step is you don't actually synthesize in that step. Sequencing by binding, which
Oh, quantum. Is that quantum or something like this?
no. This is why this is the problem. Then my name. So I was just thinking, like one of the things we were talking about the different sequencing companies. Of
Yeah,
course, there's
yeah,
also
yeah.
the ones that have gone by the wayside. So there's Qiagen, there's Genapsys, but this was it's not Quantapore. It's
It's not quantum psi or quantum c.
Quantum
No.
Size, a protein sequencing company. No, it starts with something else. It'll come to me later. It was interesting because I once wrote a blog piece where what I did is, the interesting thing about startup companies, if you're a startup company, you, to some degree, have no requirements to release information. Like public companies, you have to constantly be informing your investors. But private companies, you can control as much information as you want. So a lot of them go into really deep stealth mode and release nothing. And then eventually, of course, there are reasons they need to release information to draw new investors in or to get collaborators and so forth. So again, people do, Ultima did this, really carefully. Of course, they had a veteran person in there, Daron, their CSO, had deep background in foundation medicine, helicos, and so he could make the collaborations at places like the Broad without stirring up a lot of noise. But yeah, but anyway, I wrote this piece where what I did is I just went and looked to see what jobs the different companies. I looked at their website and I looked at what jobs they were advertising. And this company, which is just Omniome,
Omnium.
I predict it was the next one to launch because they had job openings that were very like commercialization. There were
Mm.
things like reagent production, sales and marketing, all this stuff is like, and sure enough, well, they went out by getting bought. Um, by Omniome was bought by PacBio. Uh, but yeah, so the interesting thing about Omniome and Element is they brought this twist of a slightly new chemistry in. I mean, Singular is probably the most, from what we can tell, the most conservative play in terms of not radically different chemistry, and it was mostly around let's build a really inexpensive box, emphasize speed and turnaround and flexibility
Modularity. Yeah.
and
Just
modularity.
pushing on price point. Yeah.
Yeah,
And
pushing on
throughput.
price. And yeah, and unfortunately, they ran into some real problems with their supply chain, which delayed their launch, and the Elements launching at the same time, and they're both competing for the same market, and so now they've pivoted. Well, they've been acquired. They were public. They've now been acquired by basically a venture firm, an investment firm, uh, and they're focused on the spatial aspect, which I think the whole spatial field is and single cell is interesting. I did this whole study on it for someone, and yeah, part of it is like, okay, what are the boundaries? Like, is this company spatial or not? Is this company single cell or not? And then some of the technologies are definitely uh, and I'm gonna totally fail in thinking of names right now, but some of the technologies are like, yeah, they're spatial and they're single cell, but they don't do anything like what any other spatial or single cell company does. So should you talk about them at the same time? Because there's some of these companies that are getting into more. It's like cell cell interactions, and so you're doing that at what is probably single cell, and you may be able to. You're getting spatial relationships, but it's not like what most people think of as spatial, where you're slicing tissue and you're imaging things on this 2D tissue or 3D tissue, as some of the companies are going into. But it's more of a I get an interaction map of who's talking to who, but I don't necessarily get to layer that onto a piece of tissue and be able to see how that goes with histology or anything like that. So it's like, is that spatial? Is that single cell? Is that do we need a new bit of jargon to describe these kind of companies? Uh, yeah, this
But yeah,
which
getting
always keeps you on your toes here.
absolutely, and that's what's fun
There's
about it.
always something
Again,
new.
and watching how the language emerges from it. But yeah, getting back to the sequencing aspect of it, because I brought up quantum. I think you're right. That is more so protein, but I think they have
Yeah,
some binding kinetic component to it. So I was
yeah,
kind of cross talking
exactly.
my
Yeah,
wires there. But on the new sequencing tech, it is kind of fun to watch that happen, right? Like a lot of the base tech is sequenced by synthesis, but then some differentiating factor that again
right.
pushes throughput, pushes clarity. I think people are just pushing quality scores like to another level,
Yeah,
and that forces that conversation of competition with Illumina, and you're seeing them making pretty crazy changes moving
right.
forward with the MySeq discussion, the iSeq 100s hitting the markets, even across applied fields, even including public health. We're seeing that kind of proliferate rapidly.
I think one of the other things that is just interesting and a little terrifying to contemplate is you think about it, like, and there was just one of the founders of Illumina, it's Nick something, has been posting on LinkedIn his recollections of the very early days of Select. He was at Selecta, the very early days of Selecta, and it's fascinating. Like when they first put, it's like it first works. Um, or think about like I there was an attempt to recruit me to a company that did not take off in 2000, never got funded, to develop George Church's sequencing by ligation, and his like the initial data for that is buried in there's a 1999 George Church NAR nucleic acid research paper that it's in the supplementary material. You have to dig, you have to know which paper to look for. You dig, and there's basically the first like individual bases. But in those days, yeah, if you want to prove a concept, get people excited about it, all you need to be able to do is show, like, I got some bases. Or, Illumina, they got really excited because they'd resequenced PhiX, which has now been resequenced, several. You need very big scientific notation. How many times we've resequenced PhiX? Uh, Nowadays, you think of it, and so go on, like Ion Torrent, some of their initial, I'm trying to remember what their first, like, proof of principle is, probably sequencing E. coli. So that's already, like, we've gone from, you know, I need to,
Nuts.
like, sequence PUC 13 or PUC 19 or M13 to sequence PhiX, which is a bit bigger, to I've got to sequence E. coli to show that I have something. And I think,
That's the
some
new
other companies
standard.
that Ultimate's first data release was like multiple genome in a bottle samples. That is the bar now. Is like, and you see this like if with Roche similarly, if you want to be serious about saying I have a new sequencing tech, there's probably ways you could do it other ways, but for a lot of things, that is the bar. You must initially, at your first presentation, show that you can sequence multiple human genomes and show quality stats against everything else. So it's like if you have some idea for a great, which is also another way. There might be someone who comes up with a great idea for sequencing, except it would have been great 20 years ago. But now it's like it's just not on the board
We're
anymore.
zooming. We're zooming in terms of
Yeah, no,
expectations.
it's just crazy the expectation. And then the other one I like to point out though is, I mean, because people, and again, this is kind of academic, but because people wonder about, well, how much sequencing market is there really? And this is an issue right now. Like Illumina is worth about half one of the diagnostics companies that uses Illumina technology. So the value maybe has moved farther down, but it's like, how much more sequencing capacity do we need? People always say that.
Mm.
If you is this just a race to the bottom and they're all going to go bankrupt because they're going to reduce the price to zero. But if you start thinking about the microbiome and environmental
Mm.
DNA and how
Ooh.
much diversity is out there in the world, it should like almost terrify you. Like how much biodiversity is out there. And I know from my experience with Warp Drive, we were looking for natural products, that the way we did things, we looked through 135,000 bacteria originally for one specific class of genes. Basically. You can think of it. We were looking for natural products, so compounds, but you sequence to find the genes that make them, and there were very specific genes that were diagnostic of what we were looking for. And two of the things we were looking for, we found only one time. That suggests if you're statistically minded, we did not saturate. It was not like,
Hmm.
if we sequenced another 135,000, I would kind of expect to find some more members of that group. Like we have probably not exhausted. Another one is we never found that set some of the known molecules, including, if I remember correctly, avermectin, which is ivermectin, which won the Nobel Prize, um, which should come out of that class of organisms.
Hmm.
So, and that's just a little taste of things. And you go into almost any of the literature on, if people go and look in different environments, it's just this crazy like long tail phenomenon where there's a lot of really abundant organisms, and then there's a bunch of less abundant and less abundant and less abundant and less, and you
Yeah.
keep going out, and then you
Constant
start thinking,
diversity curves. Yeah.
yeah, this crazy diversity curve. And then, like the way I always think about it is, then you start thinking about all the different microenvironments here, the very different environments. Like even in just my small yard, we have like an area that is inundated some part of the year. We have areas that get intense sunlight. We have areas that are woods. Then you get even smaller stuff, like stuff that's up near the foundation, where the pH is going to be more basic because of lime leaching out of the concrete. And that's just one little slice, one tiny slice of Massachusetts. I go to many other slices of Massachusetts. Go to like, when I was first thinking about warp drive, it was like this idea got in my head is like go to a tidal zone at the beach, and we have some gorgeous beaches here in Massachusetts. But of course, a lot of coastal U.S. has gorgeous beaches, but we have a lot with like tide pools and rocks, and we have, the tides here are substantial. They're not as big as, you've got to go to the Bay of Fundy sometime. It's just unreal up there what the tides are. But you think about it, you have this zone along the tidal areas that, it goes wet and dry during the day, and that's going to affect what can live there, especially at the microbe level. And then you think about, you have the stuff very close to the ocean where the salinity is one thing, and then you have things farther up a tidal river where the salinity is going to be dropping, and then you have temperature differences and how much sunlight do they get, and what's growing there, algae and so forth that are again going to create new microenvironments. And so you start thinking about that, and again, that's just Massachusetts. And I love to travel, so I've been to beaches, and it, like one that kind of blows me away because the latitudes aren't that different. But if you go out to the Pacific Northwest, go to Olympic National Park, the tide pools look really different. They have different organisms in them. And so presumably that's the macro stuff. Just imagine how different it must be at a micro level. And those are just two small places. Now, go around the world, even, keep going at the same latitude, but now go to different latitudes. So you start thinking about that is like, what is the ultimate diver? And you think about all the weird places people find, bacteria growing in oil reservoirs underground. And it's like, what is the total biodiversity of microbes in the Earth's biosphere? It must be just a staggering number. And then there's, of course, the stuff that's been locked in permafrost. There's spores. People have revived spores out of
Absolutely.
certain kinds of soft coal. It's like, wow, if we just wanted to spelunk just a small fraction of that, we haven't begun. I mean,
Yeah.
places have done, people have done interesting microbiome stuff. There's, again, I love to tout what we did at Warp Drive, sequencing through actinomycetes specifically. But the task, if you really want to discover all that and discover all that diversity, discover all those different protein folds and sequences, discover all the natural products that they can make, all the fascinating the chemistry that nature can perform is just unreal. it's going to take a lot of sequence.
There's a
What
lot
we have
more.
isn't nearly up to the task for doing
No,
that.
you're bringing up such a great point. I love where your head is at here because not only the ecological niches you've described, but I was just speaking to Momo Vujicic from Biome over here,
Uh,
actually in the Seattle area. I think this is George Church associated company
yeah,
as well, where they're doing RNA-seq on microbes, or rather
yeah,
microbiomes. Right. And I was one of the points of conversation I was having with him is, when I think about RNA-seq experiments, still, if you were to order that assay or get that done at a lab out of the box, that's maybe like $1,500, $2,000 a sample. And on their end, they've really optimized a lot of the sample prep and automation, so they're able to commercially allow that or offer that test for like $300 a sample. But they're still using base Illumina sequencing, right? So there's still aspects in that product where you can see further optimization. And in Momo's world, in the Viome, vision of the universe, everyone's getting their microbiome sequenced.
yeah,
Right, that
yeah.
becomes a regular part. So you see the health aspects to that, and people keep pushing that forward. So I agree with you wholeheartedly. I think from our perspectives, again, biased, but there's a lot of DNA to sequence. There's a lot more
Yeah.
to learn about what's happening. So this competition and racing to increase throughput, increase accuracy, increase some of the automation and ease to which to actually generate the data is worthwhile.
And then, that also brings up the other sort, because of course the cost is complicated. It's a bunch of things, but especially say RNA-seq, or especially when you start talking microbes. If you really could feed, like someone drops a Ultima UG100 in my garage, and I'm like, okay, I'm going to feed that by sequencing individual bacteria. You put a lot of bacteria on that flow cell, and then you start realizing like, oh, like if it's $100 or $80 for a human genome equivalent, that's a lot of bacteria, depending on the genome size. For Streptomyces, it would be like 400 of them. Wow, I can get 400 for $100, except I've got to make libraries out of them. It's going to cost me a hell of a lot more than $100 to do 400 libraries. And so I think that's what we're increasingly going to see. I mean, there's always been this tug of war between the two, especially early on, say, early days of Illumina, like, say, 2008, 2009. The sequence generation, especially, and on almost anything, sequence generation cost was just so big. The library prep cost wasn't such a worry. But as the cost came down, particularly for smaller genomes, it became more and more of an issue. And now with, whole genomes starting to go, or other sorts of things. So into clinic and so forth, and there's going to be pressure from insurance companies, and it's like, okay, how do we cut the cost? And at some point, it's like, well, the sequencer's no longer the cost, or drop the sequencing cost to zero, the actual data generation cost to zero, and we still got the expense of extracting DNA, tracking, and especially the library. So
And then the backside of that too, the data
and
storage and
processing.
analytics.
Yep, yep. No, that's all. Data storage is not free, especially if you put your data in the cloud. You very quickly become very familiar with how it is not free. So yeah, I think this is an area that sometimes has gotten a lot less attention is how do we reduce library costs? And also, the other thing I think with sequencers, because we can talk about, we can sequence the microbiome. We could see, maybe we're going to go in every year at our physical and leave a sample behind and get our microbiome sequenced. We're going to, get my genome sequenced. All the different ways we think about there. But there's all these other ways to use DNA to get things that are not sequenced. And I think that's one of the fascinating things about NGS is the extent to which people have figured out clever assays so you convert some other phenomena into tags. So you think about like ChIP-seq is one example. Like convert and of course there's many many others. ChIP-seq, cut and run, cut and tag, uh, all these different ways to get different types of essentially epigenetic information and convert it into sequences, which you now sequence. And then you can go into more. Like there's one paper I really it's on my list of things you should blog, and I should get around to. But it was kind of interesting, and it goes back to a technique that again I understand very superficially, but it's fascinating. There's all this interest these days in training machine learning models, and I think AlphaFold is clearly a machine learning model that does really valuable stuff, and it's relative. There's all these other models that make a lot of claims so far. it's not clear how many of those can really back it up with interesting, really driving experiments. And we're in early days. But one of the challenges with any kind of machine learning is you need data to train on. The better your data set, the better you are. And like AlphaFold got the benefit from basically 50 plus years of crystallographers and other structural biologists depositing their data in PDB, making it freely available, and that was a very a good data set to build on. Some of the known weaknesses in AlphaFold are because of the biases in PDB. It's weaker on membrane proteins. There's a lot less coverage of them, so AlphaFold's not as good with membrane proteins. A similar sort of thing, I've seen something of, and Simon Barnett, who's on the financial side and sometimes writes a bit, and is a very interesting writer, understands the tech side a lot, that if you look at trying to predict small molecule protein interactions, you have this problem that the databases of that show a small molecule in a crystal structure are insanely biased towards protein kinases because that's where a lot of pharmaceutical interest was, and protein kinases crystallized well. So you have this problem. So you have things, and for example, I'll just throw out a quick touting of a product. Ginkgo has a division called a business unit called Data Points, and this is one of the ideas: is that we can do complicated data points can do relatively complicated assays and run high throughput screens and basically generate sequence data out that is like expression profiles in a Cas9 kind of experiments, or they just released a cell painting data set where we can characterize antibodies every which way and do it at high throughput and then data set, and it goes into machine learning because that's what we really need. So I think there's this interesting question of what are the other machine learning data sets that we really need, and how can we generate them, and in particular, can you convert some phenomenon? And like I said, epigenetics is a big one, but there are others. Is there, in the end, can you make a high throughput sequencer a universal measuring device where you can measure, the dream would be measure any phenomenon. And again, to show just, I came out of George's lab, I keep up with them, I run into them sometimes. Like one of the wilder ones that he proposed was, if I remember right, it's a neutrino detector based on DNA. So you'd make a whole lot of DNA, you'd stuff it in some sort of a space. It was actually no, it wasn't neutrinos, it was WIMPs. It's one of these candidates for dark matter. Dark matter is basically this this big like kind of holding. I'm trying to think the right thing. It's like we don't know what's going on, but there's something that the standard model of physics works really well, except, and we'll cover that except with, we'll call it dark matter, and then there's all sorts of ideas about what is dark matter, and the whole the real one of the big challenges, as I understand it, again, not a physicist, is the whole reason we have this issue with the model is if the stuff really exists and it's not just our model is completely screwed up. This model that explains so much so very well is it doesn't interact much with like light or normal matter or all these other things. And so there's all these proposals for exotic particles, and they're inherently hard to detect. So anyway, I don't remember the details. I can go and find it. It's a preprint somewhere. If I remember right, it's to build a detector for WIMPs, which are weakly interacting massive particles. But they're one of these candidates for dark matter. And again, it's one of these like, what can you do? What's the crazy? Can you just somehow by some molecular, either inherent properties of DNA or by some molecular biology or genetics tricks, convert phenomenon X into sequence tags, and then I can read. Now you can read the sequence tags out. And if you look, there's a lot of just start searching for -seq in papers, and people are presenting one or more things. They're mostly in biology, but you do have these other sort of things. In fact, it's slightly different, but a related one. I was traveling recently. Where was it? Because I think I photographed it. I think it was in the Netherlands, where it was claimed that something was protected with DNA, that they'd like sprayed something with DNA tags, and so like if it was stolen and recovered, they could. I can't remember what it was. It was some authenticity or something, which is an idea that's been kicking around for a while. And I always wonder, sometimes, some people install fake CCTV cameras to make it, so it could be this is all a big bluff, but it is something. It's like, maybe it's real. but it's an interesting, to me, an interesting use of sequencing is that a certain amount of sequencing, a lot of sequencing will be used to explore biology directly because we're sequencing DNA and RNA that's natural. A certain amount is going to be used to explore biology that is, in a sense, unnatural, and that, and this is something Ginkgo loves to do. Of we're going to but there's all these other ways. We're going to convert some biological phenomenon into tags, one way or another, or into signals. I wrote a piece almost exactly a year ago about these fiber-seq and these other kind of other methods that work with PacBio or nanopore sequencing, where you layer, you in the ideal case, you get the sequence with any variation, you get the native methylation, and you've artificially methylated only where the DNA is exposed, where the chromatin is open. And so you get chromatin open information. And again, it's this cool thing of like, okay, I've figured out a way to convert something that's biological but not sequence into sequence. And then the ultimate one is, what are all the things that have nothing to do with biology, but we can
That could be
convert them into
stored.
sequence?
Yeah, DNA is
And this is
DNA
sequencer.
storage. Yeah.
DNA
Yeah. All
data
right.
storage, another great example.
I love that. Keith, we're coming up on time, so I hate to cut
Okay,
this off, but man, we got
sure.
to do this again. I think you touched on a bunch of topics too there that, you mentioned George Church. We talked about Viome, but we didn't even touch on like the colossal conversation and what is a species, ending extinction. We talked about sequencing platforms. We didn't even get to really touch on the new Roche sequence by
Yeah.
extension conversation. It sounds like you got a blog coming up too on Clive Brown, his impact on the field, and the ONT universe going forward. So we'll have to touch back on this in the future, man. This has been a blast.
Thank you, Kevin. I've enjoyed it, and yeah, I'd be happy to show up another time.
Absolutely, man. And I appreciate you taking the time to do this, to keep up with the Omics blog. As I said, I think as you're seeing, you have so many readers that find value in it, myself included. Your role in my career personally, I appreciate you've always taken the time. Even right out of grad school, we met now about 10
Yeah.
years ago over there in New York, and I still remember driving up to Boston, being able to hang out and just pick your brain about the field and how to get in it. And now I'm in it, So
Oh well, I mean, it's always amazing to hear things like that. So I'm very grateful that you felt I helped you. Then that's
absolutely, you
amazing.
did. So, Keith, yeah, we'll schedule something maybe in a couple of months and redo
Okay.
this conversation. Maybe even giving us more time to speak on all the fun little threads to pull on in our space, man. But thanks for this, and we'll catch everyone in that next one there.